So when and where does U.S. history begin? A traditional history textbook might start with Jamestown in 1607, or it might emphasize the arrival of the Puritans in Plymouth in 1620. More recently, the 1619 Project has suggested a different foundational date, 1619, when the first black slaves arrived in Virginia. Award-winning journalist Nicole Hannah-Jones and others have suggested the central role of human bondage to the American experience. Not just for African Americans, but for all Americans. But how many people would start the U.S. narrative in St. Augustine, Florida in 1565, or in a place where Africans were as likely to be free as enslaved for the next 200 years? Stick around to learn about one of them, Captain Don Francisco Menéndez, captain of the Black Militia and leader of Fort Mose, the first free black town in the continental United States. Hello everyone, and welcome to another session of AP Euroblast and another episode in our series, Black Lives in European History. I'm Philippe Seiler, and as always, I'm here to spark your interest in European history, to activate your memory, and to draw connections. This is the third and final installment in our series on Fort Mose, the first free black town in the United States. We're going to focus on the extraordinary life of Francisco Menéndez, leader of the Black Militia of St. Augustine, commander of Fort Mose, multilingualist, and survivor of slavery, including recapture, re-enslavement, and freedom for a second time. We learned about the different ethnic backgrounds of Fort Mose's people and what was life like that they formed together. We studied the origins of the fort within the nearly 100-year conflict between Spain and Britain. We learned how differences in Spanish and British views of black and native peoples were a major contributing factor to that conflict. We also learned how black people used those differences and that conflict to their advantage, namely to free themselves or help others escape slavery in British Carolina and to find a freer life and community in St. Augustine and in nearby Fort Mose. Go back and watch those videos again if you need to, and make sure to check the bibliography and suggestions for further reading in the description box. Now let's turn finally to the dramatic story of the remarkable Captain Francisco Menéndez. Through him, we can also gain a broader understanding of the experience of other black people in Spanish Florida. First and foremost, Menéndez was a tireless and effective fighter and leader. Native chiefs, Spanish governors, British magistrates, and not least of all, Menendez himself, testified to his heroic and dangerous participation in numerous conflicts. These included the Yamasee War of 1715 to 1717, defending St. Augustine against invasions in 1728 and again in 1740, and numerous raids that he led into British territory by land and by sea throughout the Spanish colonial period. We don't know the exact date or location or birth name of Captain Menéndez, but we do know that he was Mandinka, which was the third largest group represented at Fort Mose, and that he came from the modern-day country of Gambia, somewhere along the Gambia River. Although we lack details about Menendez's life there, we do know a number of things about Gambia that would be significant to his experience.
Hey, Dr. Seiler, are we about to do contextualization?
Yeah, you bet we are. A way to anticipate and pay attention. Menendez's context as a Mandinka was particularly important to his life in Florida because the incredible cultural diversity he experienced in Gambia prepared him well for the cultural diversity he experienced in Florida. Before his enslavement, Menendez would have been exposed to and probably spoke several African languages. Since the Portuguese had traded, settled, and mixed with local people since the 15th century, there's a good chance that he also spoke Creole. And that was the Portuguese African dialect that had become widespread in the 200 years before Menendez's birth. Traders from other regions spoke Arabic and French and English. So Gambia in the late 17th to early 18th centuries was a truly polyglot community. And it wasn't just that Menendez would have been comfortable with a diverse mix of cultures. These were some of the same language he would have used in Florida. Spanish wasn't one of them, but it wouldn't have been too much of a hard transition from Portuguese Creole. And by contrast, common Spanish people were probably much more limited in languages. Although top Spanish officials probably spoke some French and English, none of the Spaniards would have conversed in any of the African languages that Menendez probably knew. And Menendez's linguistic fluidity was an asset that he could use to his advantage.
Hey, Dr. Seiler, contextualization can be pretty cool.
I know, right? Menendez would have also been exposed to a mix of religious traditions, African animistic practices, as well as Catholicism and Islam. Throughout our series on Black lives in European history, we've been emphasizing the social and cultural fluidity of the Iberian world, in Europe as well as in the Americas. So it's interesting to note that the social fluidity that we observed already in our first 2 episodes on Fort Mose had African as well as European origins. Now back to some specifics about Menendez. Historians guess that he was captured and brought into slavery in Carolina sometime between 1709 and 1711, in the midst of a quickly growing plantation-based slave society. And although we don't know the year of his birth, he was old enough by 1715 to fight hard for the next 3 years in the Yamasee War. After their defeat, many of the Yamasee and the Black allies sought refuge in St. Augustine, and Menendez was among them. Since he had fought as a free man for the past 3 years, he might have expected to remain free, especially in Spanish Florida, which had established official sanctuary for escaped slaves since the royal decree of 1693. Others, however, had different plans for him, starting with a native chief, Perro Bravo, or Wild Dog in English. Perro Bravo claimed ownership of Menendez and 3 other escapees from Carolina that he led to Florida, and he threatened to kill all of them unless the Spanish governor paid him, which he did. And Menendez was particularly unlucky with his timing because his first 3 years in St. Augustine coincided with a temporary exception in Spain's policy of freedom for escaped slaves. Governor Benavides did initially support freedom for slaves, but it didn't last. Benavides seems to have sensed an opportunity for personal profit and conveniently interpreted the 1693 decree to apply only to his slaves who had escaped up until the time of the decree. From 1729 to 1737, at least some Carolina slaves became and remained Florida slaves. But as we saw in the previous 2 episodes, slavery in Florida was still a much freer existence than slavery on a Carolina plantation. In the 1720s and 1730s, the Spanish in St. Augustine sent regular raiding parties to liberate black slaves in Carolina. According to British testimony, the raiding parties were often all black and Native American, and they were led by black people. Their success and reliability gained the trust of Spanish officials, and Governor Benavides even made plans to send an expedition in 1733 to start a general uprising against the Carolina plantation owners. Menendez's geographical and linguistic knowledge on top of his military experience in the Yamasee War made him invaluable to Spain. Recognizing his ability, he was made captain of the Black Militia in 1726. And when he wasn't fighting, he learned another valuable skill. He became literate. And we know this because we have record of his petitions for himself and for others to be free from slavery. Now you might be asking, how do we know that Menendez actually wrote those letters? And that would be a really good question because after all, in colonial times, lots of illiterate people used notaries to write letters for them. Well, we know that Menendez actually wrote these letters because there are no signing statements on the letters, which typically a notary would put and then sign with the notary's signature if he was writing for an illiterate person. And none of that appears on Menendez's letters. We can even see his signature at the end of the letter, not an X, which is what an illiterate person would have written. And moreover, the style of his signature matches the style of the writing. So we can be quite confident that Menendez actually did become literate. And Menendez wrote with style, not just the handwriting, but the rhetoric. Consider this letter to the king following the British attack on St. Augustine in 1740. He delicately balances an emphasis of his selfless service to the crown and to the Catholic faith with a clear request to be paid for his sacrifices. Now, if we can go inside Menendez's head for a moment, hard to do in the present, let alone in the past, we might imagine that he was saying something like, "Hey, King Philip V, you've no idea how hard I've been working for you. You're lucky to have such a loyal subject. So pay me!" But this is what he actually wrote, that he deserved payment for the loyalty, zeal, and love I have always demonstrated in the royal service, in the encounters with the enemies, and I have been continually at arms and assisted in the maintenance of the bastions without the least royal expense. Later in the letter, he emphasizes, "My sole object was to defend the Holy Evangel," in other words, the Catholic faith, "and sovereignty to the crown." And then he wraps up the letter with a flourish, asking to receive all the consolation of the royal support, which Christianity requires and your vassals desire. Wow, way to sweet talk the king, right? It didn't pay off, but that's not the main point. Thousands of other Spaniards of all shades wrote similar letters at different times and places, and were no more successful than Menendez in getting the crown's tight fist to open and pay them. The point is that Menendez had become skilled at writing in what was probably his third or fourth language. So how did Menendez learn to write and to write with such pizzazz? Our best guess is that Menendez learned to write from his master, who was also his godfather, the royal treasurer Francisco Menéndez Marquez. That's right, Menendez took his name from his master, and that's not very unusual either. This followed a common pattern between lower and higher status people in the Iberian and Iberian American societies. Now, we don't know what duties he performed for the treasurer, but certainly much of the treasurer's time would have been spent writing. So this is somebody who would have been very able to teach Menendez quite well. And Don Francisco couldn't have found a more prestigious protector. Menéndez Marquez came from a long line of Spanish Floridian treasurers, some of whom had served as interim governors. And he was even directly related to the original founder of St. Augustine, Pedro Menéndez de Avilés. Captain Menendez may well have accompanied Treasurer Menéndez Marquez on his diplomatic as well as military missions into Carolina territory. Now, this included a raid in 1725, which quite possibly led to Captain Menendez's military promotion the following year. We do know from the words of others that Captain Menendez was able to impress people in positions of power. So perhaps that was the case with the treasurer as well. In 1738, Captain Menendez impressed another person in power, and his petitions finally paid off. The new governor, Manuel de Montiano, released Menendez from captivity and appointed him commander of Fort Mose. 2 years later, Governor Montiano was able to witness firsthand Captain Menendez's courage and leadership when the British invaded. Now, it's standard practice for somebody in the governor's position to write a general report about the bravery of his people while under attack. It's much less frequent for somebody to include an extended recommendation on the services of a particular individual. And that is exactly what Governor Montiano did for Menendez. And moreover, Montiano clearly viewed Menendez as the person in charge of Fort Mose. Now, technically, Menendez reported to a white officer, but Montiano's correspondence to the king refers to the people of the village as Menendez's subjects. Menendez also definitely attracted the attention of his enemies. The British finally captured Menendez in 1741 when he was on yet another corsairing raid of South Carolina. The quartermaster of a British ship referred to him in court later as Francisco, that cursed seed of Cain, cursed from the foundation of the world. You're probably thinking, wow, that was harsh. Why all the hostility? Well, it's because Menendez was a remarkable foe who had recently been central to Spanish recapture of Fort Mose. Now, that was a military humiliation for the British, but for many it was also a physical one, since several British soldiers had been castrated during the fighting. And even more recently, that same ship that captured Menendez had been in New York, where a series of fires were blamed on a group of black slaves. And like Menendez, they had been captured from Spanish colonies where they had been loyal, free Catholic subjects. And these slaves that led the uprising in the fire in New York represented three things that the British despised. They're Spanish subjects, they're Catholics, and they were black slaves who had rebelled. And on top of that, Menendez showed a calm confidence to his captors that apparently drove them wild with anger. We have record of Menendez addressing himself to the captain of the ship as Señor Francisco Menéndez, and as captain of the black militia. He denied giving orders for the mutilations that had happened at Fort Mose. But the use of these titles implied that he considered himself to be equal in status to the British captain of the ship. Continuing in the same self-assured manner, Menendez told the ship's captain that he had planned to use the money from the raid to sail to Havana and then on to Spain. He expected to be received in the royal court of the king and rewarded for his numerous services to the crown. For his insolence, the British officer ordered Menendez tied to a cannon and given 200 lashes across the backside. He then had him pickled. In other words, he had salt water and vinegar poured into his wounds, and then, and I quote, left him to the doctor to care for his sore arse. The British then brought Menendez to the Bahamas, and he was sold as a slave. But somehow by 1752, he was back in St. Augustine as a free man, and again as captain of the Black Militia. Now, there are basically three ways that this could have happened, and they all look good for Menendez. Possibility number one, like he had done with the Spanish in Florida, Menendez appealed to his British captors to release him and give him his freedom. Not too likely. Possibility number two, he escaped somehow. Possibility number three, Spain paid a ransom for him because they valued his services so much and all the skills that he had. The rest of Menendez's life is a lot less documented, but it closely follows the fate of Spanish Florida. Spain surrendered Florida to Great Britain in 1763. This was part of the peace arrangement that ended the 7 Years' War. And when that happened, Menendez, like most of the rest of the Spanish population, left Florida and went to Cuba. Here again, he and the people of Fort Mose were expected to be people of the frontier in a place called Fort Matanzas. But within a very short time, Menendez had moved to Havana, the capital. And there, Menendez's trail disappears. We don't know how much longer he lived nor where he died. But if we can calculate that he was at least in his teens at the time of the Yamasee War, and that seems a reasonable assumption, then he would have been at least in his 60s at the time of the evacuation of Florida. It would be nice to think that Captain Menendez returned to Florida in 1784 when Spain regained Florida as part of the fighting in the American Revolution against the British. And if that were so, then maybe someday his remains would be discovered and his grave would finally be marked with the recognition that he deserves. That, of course, is unlikely. Few people in the 18th century lived such a long life, and even fewer who had lived such a hard life as Menendez's. I hope you've enjoyed this edition to Black Lives in European History. If you'd like to learn more, you can check the resources. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. And as always, keep learning. Thanks for watching. It's been a blast.